They built a steam locomotive so powerful and heavy it outclassed the legendary Big Boy, yet it crushed the rails beneath it, triggered a multi-million-dollar legal scandal, and vanished within a decade. The truth behind this machine's downfall reveals a secret that shook the industry. But what forced the Chesapeake and Ohio to gamble everything on such a dangerous design? Coal trains thundered through the mountains between Virginia and West Virginia, each one loaded to the limit, and crawling up the unforgiving slopes of the Allegheny Range. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway faced a relentless challenge, moving more coal than ever before over a route defined by a 0.57% ruling grade east of White Sulphur Springs. Wartime demands had turned this stretch into a critical artery, with traffic swelling far beyond what older engines could handle. The numbers told the story, coal shipments surged, and the tracks became a conveyor belt feeding the industrial heart of the nation. But the terrain refused to cooperate. Every mile of mountain meant lost time, extra fuel, and the constant threat of bottlenecks as trains stacked up behind slow-moving drags. The Chesapeake and Ohio's existing fleet, dominated by two 882 articulated locomotives, strained under the load. Their slow pace no match for the new tempo of war. Tunnel clearances had been widened, but even with these improvements, the railroad needed a locomotive that could do more than just pull. It had to do it faster, longer, and heavier than anything before. The pressure was mounting. Each train that crested the summit carried not just coal, but the weight of a logistical puzzle that demanded a radical solution. For the Chesapeake and Ohio, the answer would have to be nothing less than a superweapon built for the mountains themselves. Lima Locomotive Works, working hand-in-hand with the Chesapeake and Ohio's Advisory Mechanical Committee, set out to build something the rails had never seen. The result was a machine defined as much by its physical form as by its purpose. The Allegheny's 2666 wheel arrangement stood alone among modern locomotives: 2 leading wheels, 2 sets of 6 massive drivers, and an unprecedented 6-wheel trailing truck. This radical plan was not just for show, it was the only way to carry the immense weight and size of what lay behind the drivers. A firebox so wide and deep it covered an area of 135 square feet. That firebox demanded support beyond anything a 4-wheel truck could handle. Instead, Lima designed a cast steel 6-wheel trailing truck, distributing the load and allowing the firebox to stretch further and burn hotter than any rival. The locomotive's rear end, with its deep squared-off frame and broad support, became its signature. This was not just a quirk of style, it was a direct answer to the Chesapeake and Ohio's demand for sustained, high-speed power over long mountain grades. The firebox and boiler, with over 7,000 square feet of heating surface, could feed 4 giant cylinders and keep the steam pressure high, mile after mile. Every inch of the Allegheny's frame, from the 67-inch boxpock drivers to the angled tender designed to squeeze more water and coal into the limits of existing turntables, reflected a single obsession: more fire, more steam, more speed. The collaboration between Lima's engineers and the railroad's committee produced a locomotive whose anatomy was dictated by need, not tradition. In its profile, the Allegheny was all business. Every wheel, every brace, every plate of steel focused on turning raw Appalachian coal into relentless forward motion. Numbers alone could not capture the sensation of an Allegheny at full stride, but they came close. In official tests, the locomotive delivered between 7,500 and 8,000 horsepower at the drawbar, more than any other reciprocating steam engine of its time. This was not just a record on paper. It meant that, on the mountain grades between Virginia and West Virginia, an Allegheny could take a train of 160 loaded cars over 14,000 tons and bring it from a standstill to 19 miles per hour in a single mile of track. At speed, the 4 giant cylinders and massive boiler worked together to sustain nearly 7,000 horsepower for mile after mile, far outpacing the older drag freight locomotives in both speed and output. But that kind of power came with a price. Each run demanded a constant flow of fuel and water. The tender behind every Allegheny carried 25 tons of coal and 25,000 gallons of water, but even that was rarely enough for a hard mountain district. At full throttle, the engine could burn through more than 10,000 pounds of coal every hour and boil off over 10,000 gallons of water, forcing the railroad to attach auxiliary water cars for the longest runs. Firemen and mechanical stokers raced to keep the firebox fed, shoveling coal at a rate few could match. Every trip became a battle against the locomotive's own appetite, with water stops and coal supplies dictating the rhythm of the railroad. The Allegheny's hunger for resources was the direct result of its design: more heat, more steam, more speed, and more weight delivered to the rails than anything that had come before. What the Chesapeake and Ohio gained in horsepower, it paid back in mountains of coal and rivers of water, fueling a machine that pushed the limits of steam technology and the men who ran it. Every trip behind an Allegheny was a test not just for the men in the cab, but for the rails and bridges beneath its steel wheels. Mile-long coal trains, some tipping the scales at over 14,000 tons, stretched from horizon to horizon, the couplers groaning as the locomotive's 4 cylinders poured power into the rails. The sheer mass in motion was staggering. A single H8 could press down with more than 80,000 pounds on each driving axle, a figure that climbed even higher as the engines were reweighed in service. Some axles, according to later records, bore nearly 87,000 pounds, pushing the limits of what mainline track and bridges were designed to carry. Track gangs worked in the shadows, tamping ballast and replacing battered ties as the passage of each loaded train left its mark. Ballast pumped under the weight, rails flexed and settled, and the rhythmic pounding of the drivers echoed through the valleys. Maintenance crews logged extra hours battling accelerated wear, spikes worked loose, tie plates shifted, and bridge inspectors watched for signs of fatigue in steel and concrete. Each additional ton the locomotive carried translated directly into more work for the men who kept the railroad running. For the C&O, these were not abstract calculations. The cost of moving so much coal at speed was measured in tons of replacement rail, overtime for track crews, and the constant vigilance required to keep the main line open. The railroad's investment in stronger bridges and heavier rail sections was tested daily by the relentless parade of Allegheny-powered trains. The physical toll was real, and it made the question of the locomotive's true weight more than a matter of pride or paperwork. Every pound mattered, to the men on the ground, to the budget, and to the future of the line. Weight was a number that could not be ignored. On delivery, Lima Locomotive Works guaranteed the Allegheny's mass would stay within strict limits. But as the first locomotives entered service, C&O's own weighbridge data told a different story. When engine 1604 rolled onto the scales at Clifton Forge, the dials spun past expectations by tens of thousands of pounds. Some driving axles bore nearly 87,000 pounds each, pushing the entire locomotive's working weight over 770,000 pounds. That figure quietly surpassed even Union Pacific's legendary Big Boy. For the railroad, the consequences were immediate. Crew pay agreements were tied directly to weight on drivers, and the understated figures meant men in the cab and the shop had been shortchanged for every mile run. The discrepancy triggered a formal claim. C&O demanded compensation for the hidden tons and the higher costs they brought. Legal filings and internal memos crisscrossed between Lima and the railroad, with the dispute swelling to a settlement worth millions. In the end, Lima was forced to accept the corrected weight, pay out damages, and watch as the Allegheny's reputation shifted from pride to controversy. The numbers once hidden in blueprints and ledgers had become the basis for a high-stakes reckoning. Horsepower and tractive effort are often mentioned together, but for a machine like the Allegheny, the distinction shaped its entire legacy. On paper, the locomotive delivered a staggering 7,500 to 8,000 horsepower, enough to outpace any rival on the mountain grades. But raw horsepower is only part of the story. What actually gets a train moving is tractive effort, the force applied to the rails at low speed. For the Allegheny, that number stood at 110,000 pounds of force, a figure that rivaled the best in its class. Yet, unlike some other heavy freight locomotives, the Allegheny carried no booster engine on its trailing truck. Boosters, small auxiliary steam engines, could add 10,000 to 15,000 pounds of extra pulling force for the first miles out of the yard, a critical advantage when starting a loaded train on a grade. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway and Lima engineers deliberately left this feature off, betting that the locomotive's immense boiler and high weight on drivers would provide enough starting force. Their philosophy favored speed and sustained power over brute force starts. In practice, this meant the Allegheny excelled at keeping heavy trains rolling at pace, but sometimes struggled to match the low-speed grunt of rivals equipped with boosters. The trade-off was clear. The design delivered unmatched horsepower at speed, but left a gap in starting performance, a compromise born from the railroad's demand for speed, not just muscle. Today, the Allegheny's immense power sits silent in museums. It is a reminder that innovation can outpace the world it enters. As railways confront new limits, the lesson endures. Engineering ambition always leaves a mark, but it is the ground beneath that decides what survives. Share your thoughts below.